Can topical preaching be biblical? We've all heard the lousy topical sermons. In fact, if I could make a confession, one of my very first messages was a topical message about animals in the Bible. I just went through the Bible, finding different animals, and I tried to make some sort of a spiritual connection. And in one word, that message was horrendous. I mean, it was awful. And it's because of messages like that that topical preaching has been given such a bad reputation. In fact, there would be many people who would say, at the least, topical preaching is a poor choice. At the most, topical preaching is unbiblical. And there are some who would say that because of their definition of expository preaching. Now, you ask most teachers of preaching, and they're going to tell you that all preaching should be biblical preaching. And most professors of preaching would tell you that biblical preaching equals expository preaching. But where the waters get a little bit muddy is in defining expository preaching. And really there are two models, two views of expository preaching. One model, in fact I would say the common model, is to say that expository preaching equals verse-by-verse explanation of a passage. And you really stay within the confines of that one passage. You might bring in a supporting passage from time to time, but primarily you're working within that one passage. And this particular model of preaching usually looks at preaching as kind of disjointed, kind of disconnected with a few different categories of preaching. You have expository preaching as one category or one type of preaching. You have topical preaching as a type or category of preaching. And you have textual preaching as a type or category of preaching. And the lines do not cross. They do not intersect in the slightest. But the second model of preaching has a little bit broader of a definition of expository preaching. And this definition of expository preaching would simply claim that expository preaching is any sermon that attempts to explain the meaning of a biblical text or texts. This could include topical sermons. This model looks a little bit differently. It looks more like a funnel, with expository preaching right at the bottom of the funnel, and with a few items that you're dropping at the top of the funnel. One of those items would be what we might call passage preaching or pericopal preaching, where you take one passage, drop it in the funnel, and you preach that passage. Another item that you might drop in the funnel is a topical sermon, where you're going to look at a topic from a few different passages, and you're going to drop it down and explain what those passages mean. A third item you might drop into the funnel is a textual sermon, where you might focus on one sentence or one verse and try to explain that one sentence or verse for the entirety of the message. And in that model, topical preaching can, in fact, be biblical. So, can topical preaching be biblical? Well, depending on your definition of expository preaching, yes. And in future episodes, we might have a chance to talk about how to preach good quality, biblical, topical sermons.